Hello guys, welcome to another episode of our channel. Okay, today we will look at market failure essay, but we will focus our attention on the policy application. Usually for market failure question, they are very commonly tested in your CSQ under the 10 mark or your essay under the 15 mark. Because for market failure policy, you will definitely need to do application. This is a very common question type for policy question because you have to compare if the policies are effective, talk about which is better, for example. So today, let's see how we apply that to market failure essay, which is also a question that you should score because the steps are again quite standard because the policies are fixed. The policies are fixed to the problems that you identify in your usually part A 10 mark question. So you just have to, in part B, talk about how the policies work and then evaluate. So here, the session will focus more on how do you evaluate, less of the application of the content because that is very straightforward. So we will spend less time on that. Okay, so when we look at the preamble, this is a continuation of a previous part A, which is about identifying the causes of market failure. So looking at the preamble, we can see that the causes of market failure are quite straightforward. So the first is about your negative externality because they talk about how fast fashion can have environmental damage. So we know that environmental damage is a very common negative externality example because people who are not involved in the process is actually affected. Then the second one is about your consumer ignorance because there is this part about being unaware of the toxic substances that wearers may be exposed to when they wear the clothes. So with these two causes, the policies are usually tagged to each one of them. So the part B, which is in pink, is asking for us to discuss. So here discuss the action word. We know that this is an evaluation question because you have to provide a view. So discuss, evaluate, compare, assess. These are the very common eval question keywords. So when you see it, you definitely have to do some sort of examination of the policies that you are looking at. Okay, so discuss the policies that the government can implement to address market failure in fast fashion. Okay, so this question is quite nice because they talk about very obviously what's the policy for, which is to address market failure. Sometimes the question may talk about to ensure allocative efficiency. So this is the same thing, but asked in a different way. So please take note of some ways that questions may tweak but are actually asking the same thing. Okay, so when we talk about discuss the policy that they can implement, we need to think a little bit deeper, unpack what it means. How do you make sure that a policy can address a problem? So there are some parameters that we need to set up to evaluate our policies against them so that they can qualify to be a good policy that can be implemented. Because it is not sufficient to just talk about two policy, how they work to address market failure because there is no evaluation in this way. It is just elaboration. So when you talk about how the policies work, you still have to evaluate them to see whether they are good in addressing the problem. So how can you do that? So first, you set up some parameters that you will assess the policies against. So parameters here refer to, in a way, like your scoring matrix. So here I will talk about first, does the policy address the root cause? Because if the policy doesn't address the root cause, then the problem will definitely come back or remain the same. So you can't say that it can be implemented because you wouldn't want to waste resources implementing a bad policy. Okay, then the second one is in terms of implementable or not. Because if you have a policy that sounds very good on paper, but in reality is very hard to implement, maybe it is very complicated, maybe it is very resource intensive, maybe it is just isn't accepted by the society. So you have to see whether the policy are both able to address the root cause of the market failure and easy to implement or not. So of course, if the two policy score well in these two parameters, then you can argue that yes, it is a policy that can be implemented. So in this case, the question is less of which is the most effective policy, but more of the policies that you talk about need to fulfill A and B, because it is about what are the policies that can be implemented. So of course, if you say that to be a good policy, you need to be A and B. So if you fulfill A and B, naturally you are a good policy. So we try to morph our policies to do well in these two aspects. Okay, so because there are two causes, so when we write the essay, we try to at least use one policy for each problem, because if your policy only address one problem and not the other, then the market failure still happen. So in this case, usually for students, it will be really good if they can complete the mechanism and the evaluation of two policy. If you can say 3 is a bonus, but let's aim for 2, because if you can say 2 policy until very well and you evaluate them very well, you can score a 12 or 13, no issue. So that is good enough, and no need to be too caught up about, oh, I have to talk about a third policy, because usually you have no time for it, so you don't want to write 6:30 for it. So you rather focus your effort and the remaining time you have on 2 policies that you can say properly. Okay, so let's use one policy each that tackle negative externality and consumer ignorance. So in this case, I will pick my text, because my text is about the negative externality. Then the second one, I will use education campaign. This is for the consumer ignorance part, because we usually talk about education. So consumer ignorance. Okay, so step 1, we talk about how the policy work. This is your standard, because even if you have no time to evaluate, you must talk about how the policies work, because that's the content of which you will evaluate on. So step 3, we always talk about how the policies work. This comes before your evaluation, because if you evaluate before you even write down how the policies work, then it wouldn't make a lot of sense, because you can only evaluate something after you have mentioned it. Okay, so this one I will skip because it is quite straightforward, but I want to focus more on about how do you evaluate the 2 policies against the parameters that we mentioned earlier. So do they address the root cause of the market failure, and is it implementable? So let's look at for the tax and education campaign, do they fulfill or not? So step 4 is our evaluation. Okay, so perhaps let's draw a table. So we evaluate our policy against the 2 parameter. So this is my text, this is my education campaign. Okay, so it's a little illegible, but yep. Then we evaluate against the root cause, and then our implementable or not. So when you talk about each of them, you have to justify your answer. So here, when we look at for tax, does it address the root cause of the market failure? So for tax, it is targeting the presence of negative externality, and we know that how tax works is that it will take on the size of the negative externality that is produced and forces the suppliers, in this case the suppliers, because they are the ones that produce without caring about the third party negative impact to the environment. So the tax is meant to help the producers internalize that negative externality in the form of higher prices that they have to pay for the production. Hence, it will reduce the quantity that they supply. So in this case, it will, to quite a large extent, yes, because you are addressing the negative externality. Because it would be a little bit difficult for the suppliers to think very downstream what the impact of their actions are. But if you use something that is painful enough to remind them that, hey, this is the damage that you have on the environment and you pay for it, it will make them be aware of it and then to incorporate that in their action. So in terms of that, you should raise this point to talk about why do you think it addressed the root cause, because it will really reverse their production ambition and then make them produce less because they are now aware of the harm of their action through the tax. So talk about that, and the tax would sufficiently score quite well here. Okay, then in terms of implementability, implementing a tax is easy, but to accurately measure the size of the tax would be very difficult, because the say government, they can perhaps measure how much liters of waste, how much tons of waste are produced, but the impact to third parties such as people who drink the water supply, they may get sick, the healthcare costs, animals who drink the polluted water and die, the cost, it is difficult to estimate. So the government may have some extent of success only in accurately measuring the size of the externality. So the accuracy in measurement is actually limited. Okay, so now you may think, oh no, does it mean that I cannot talk about tax as a good policy that I can implement? Okay, so it is not the end, because when you acknowledge that a policy has pros and cons, it actually shows that you are able to give a balanced evaluation on the policy. So now what you are supposed to do, now that you acknowledge the limitation, which is that yes, tax can be implemented, but maybe the size of the tax is not so accurate. So the government may either under tax, where they measure the extent of the externality to be too small, or they over tax, where the extent of externality that they have measured is too much. So here we will do this thing where we show that the limitations can be overcome, because when we do that, we are giving a very strong answer, because you acknowledge that this policy has its flaws, but you propose something to get around this flaw. So now you are advocating for this is still a good policy, because every policy of course has its flaws, but if you can overcome it without incurring too much cost in other area, is actually still okay. So now what we do is that we show that you can overcome. So how do you overcome? Usually, if you do more survey, perhaps you can impose a certain tax. So if you say you impose a $3 per liter of tax, then you maybe 1 year later come and survey and see whether the pollution situation is better. So maybe 3 is too little. So now I impose a $4 per liter tax. Then 1 year later you come and see, has the pollution situation improved? So if it has, it means that your tax is actually getting more and more closer to the ideal amount, which is able to capture all the negative externality. But in this case, tax would be a sufficient policy to reduce the gap, reduce the overconsume amount. It may not immediately be at the optimal level, but it could reduce the level of externality by making people internalize the impact. So I would say it is still quite a good policy, and in this case you show that the policy needs some time to become even better at being implementable. But overall it is still doing quite well in these two parameters. So in this case I would give a tax a good pass. They pass to be one of the policy that the government can use. So if the question is something different, the question says compare. So if you want to say, you want to advocate for education campaign, so when you compare, you make the limitation of tax to be bigger. So you say that the accuracy in measurement of the negative externality, it is very difficult. So you focus on how difficult it is to actually be a good accurate tax. So now you see, you either use the limitation to your advantage. If you want to advocate for that policy which you say has limitation, show how you can overcome it. If you want to shoot down this policy, use the limitation to show it is very difficult to overcome. So you see how you can evaluate based on the question requirement. But in either case, you are giving a balanced eval because you acknowledge that the policy has pros and cons. This is the most important part in evaluation. Make sure your eval is balanced. Talk about pros and cons. Pros and cons. Yep. Okay. Then let's talk about the second policy, which is the education campaign. Okay, let me use another color so you can differentiate the two policy. Okay, so for education campaign, does it address the root cause? This tackles the part about consumer ignorance about the actual cost of wearing the fast fashion clothes. So for education campaign, yes, because it will tell the consumers the actual cost. And you can talk about what form it takes. So it can be, say, an advertisement where you have visualization of maybe the microtoxic or microbacteria that is actually present in the clothes and show how it will infect your skin, things like that. So you can make it a very compelling way to close the knowledge gap for the consumer. So talk about how it tackles the root cause because it educates the consumer about the cause that they didn't know. So this is still okay. Okay, then the implementable step. Okay, in terms of implementable, I would say it is also okay because it doesn't take a super long effort to do an advertisement. But again, talk about how easy is it to change people's mindset. Because when it is about education campaign, it is always about changing people's way of thinking, changing people's perception, which sometimes is very difficult because maybe some people they don't care, they are not health conscious, they don't care about how the clothing will affect their skin or their health, or some people they don't believe it. So it depends on how convincing the advertisement is to tell the consumer to maybe consume less because it is not good for your skin. So in terms of implementable, you can say it is okay, but talk about some limitations. So you can say it will take a long time because you need to change people's mindset. Or you can say because people's mindset are difficult to change. Okay, so here again, are we showing that this is not implementable? No, right? We are just saying that it is difficult to change, but it doesn't mean I cannot change it. So what can you do to change people's mindset? Maybe I will try different ways of advertising. So maybe some people, they are more convinced when they hear people's testimonial about, oh yeah, I'm a victim of the fast fashion clothes and it makes my skin very irritable, and once I stop wearing it, then my skin become better. So some people, they will be convinced by people's experience. So show how you overcome this limitation of it being hard to change people's mindset. So you try different ways of education, or you try for a longer while. Maybe some people, they need consistent reminder to change their mindset. Try different ways, try for longer. So you see here how you acknowledge that changing people's mindset through education campaign can be very difficult, but you have some suggestion to say that it could be easily implemented after a while. So give some example to show, maybe certain people can absorb and be more receptive to testimonials or visuals, or they must see the process of how it is impacted. Maybe you show those bio cells process, things like that. So people, they receive information differently, so try that. So here now, when I look at the education campaign, I can still say that it is a good policy because it addresses these two aspects. And although they have their limitations, but there are ways to overcome it. So not an issue. Yep. Okay, so if you are able to do that well, alongside with your step 3, which is how the policy works, you can safely get a 12 mark or even a 13 mark because your mechanism works very well. So if you don't have the evaluation part, you have just the mechanism part, you can maybe get a 7 or 8 max. But with the evaluation, maybe you can get a 5 or 6 more marks. So if you get a 12, 13 over 15, it is a very, very good mark. It is if it is out of 25, if you get say 12 over 15 for part B, to get an A, you will have to score. Okay, let us see. Okay, so if you want to score an A for an essay, full essay, it will be out of 25. A is 70%, right? So 70% out of 100. Then you divide by 4. So if you divide by 4, you should get at least a 18 mark. Yeah, if you get 18 over 25, is an A. So if your part B, you get say a 12 out of 25. So for part A, you just have to get 6 out of 10. Sorry, this should be 15. You just have to get 6 out of 10, then you can get your A. So as we see, for part A, is not that hard to get a 6 mark. You just have to say the mechanism right, all this. So you can see how much the weight of eval question is lah. So try to score as high as you can, but don't forget to do step 1, which is to establish the parameters, because if you don't have that, you will just be stuck at stating the mechanism, stating the pros and cons, but you are stuck again because there's no comparison. How do you tell when policy A's policy A's con is higher than policy B's con, or how policy A's pros is better than policy B's pros. So you use something outside of the policy to weigh them against. This is really important, and students tend to miss that. Hence, they are always stuck in eval because they don't have a structure. So this provides you a structure. Even if you are not able to weigh it very well against the parameter, but if you state it at the start that you are going to use these two parameters to determine if the policy can be implemented, right, then the examiner will know that you have a structure in mind, and he or she may probably award you for that parameter part lah. Yep. Okay, so this is the end of the essay. So yes, we will focus more on the evaluation types because this is where students lose more mark, and usually about 75% of students fail their 15-mark essay due to the evaluation part. But when you have this, it will definitely give you a pass. Okay, so that's all for this question. Then we will see you in the next video. Okay, bye.